Hello and welcome back to the Crafty Corner. I'm Janna and I am so excited today because Uncharted Mariner has finally docked at port. Today we're going to be taking a look at Uncharted Mariner and we're going to be playing to the theme of Stencil Mania for the new Funkie Junkie challenge. The new Funkie Junkie challenge is open from June 29th through July 12th. For this challenge, we are challenging you to use 3 stencils in your creative makes. As always, we cannot wait to see what you create. Don't forget, you can enter through the Funkie Junkie Challenge blog, or you can enter through Instagram. Links are down in the description box. Okay, if you'd like to see which materials I'm going to be using for today's project, go ahead and pause here. All right, let's head over to the Crafty Corner. So, I am so excited. Uncharted Mariner has docked at the Crafty Corner. Before we dive right into this week's Funkie Junkie Challenge project, I wanted to take some time and label these fantastic new inks. In case you missed it, Tim had a wonderful video demoing how to label all of the different Distress Ink products. In case you missed it, Ranger recently launched a set of labels that are perfectly sized for all of our Distress Ink needs. So I'm going to be going through these labels today and color swatching all of these fabulous new products. To start with, I'm going to be labeling the Distress Ink and the Distress Oxide ink. Now, to transfer the ink over, Tim shared another fantastic tip. Use a gel plate to transfer the ink onto the labels. Simply put the sticker on your ink and then transfer. Too easy. And while we're here, you've got to check out this fantastic new pin. I absolutely love the collectible pins. These are just so cool. I can't wait to add that to my pin board. Anyway, back to inking. For inking, I'm going to take the Distress ink pad and dab a little bit directly onto the gel plate. Just a few taps. Then we'll cap the ink back up and we'll grab a sticker to match the ink pad. We're just going to pull one sticker off, and I like to place mine at the top of the ink pad just above the label. And we'll gently stick that down right here. Okay, that looks good. Now we're going to tap, tap, tap on the gel plate to pick up some ink. Just like that, we now have a neatly labeled ink pad. Now, let's go ahead and add some labels to the rest of our Distress products. To start with, I'm going to be adding a label to the Distress Paint. Now, for the Distress Paint and the Distress Oxide, I'm going to be inking these labels using the Distress Oxide ink pad. This is going to give me the closest color match to those two products. Then for the Distress Spray Stain, I'm going to be picking up the extra ink that is already on the gel plate left over from labeling the Distress ink pad. Okay, now that we have all of our projects neatly labeled, it's time to add some color to them. So first we're going to take the Distress Spray Stain and we're just going to tap that onto the gel pad, picking up some of the extra ink. And there we go, another neatly labeled product. Okay, let's get out the Distress Oxide ink pad. We're going to take that and we're going to dab a little bit of the ink onto the gel plate. So, just a few taps. Okay, that looks pretty good. And now I need to grab a label for the Distress ink pad. So, we'll just quickly peel one off and attach it to the ink pad. There, nice and simple. Okay, let's take the ink pad and transfer some of the ink. A few taps, and there we go. Okay, now I'm going to wipe off a little bit of the extra. The Distress Oxide pad was really juicy, so there's a little bit of extra ink hanging on there. Now, let's go ahead and tap the label for the Distress Oxide Spray Stain. Okay, pretty good. Give it a quick wipe and set it aside. Now we will do the same thing for the Distress Paint. A few taps. Check the label and quickly wipe off the excess. Okay, that looks great. We can go ahead and set the gel plate aside for now. Good, now let's wipe off our surface. Time for the glaze. For the glaze, I'm going to be creating a label for the top of the jar, and I'm also going to be creating a little swatch card. For these, I'm going to be pulling out the Distress Embossing Ink Dabber, and we're going to quickly smoosh that across the top of our swatch card. And then I'm going to add a little bit to this piece of white cardstock. Now I'm going to grab a piece of scrap paper to slide underneath our two pieces that will be embossed. Now I'll just slide a piece of scrap paper underneath our two pieces of paper that we're going to be embossing. This will help catch the distress glaze and prevent a mess on my work surface. Okay, let's go ahead and dump out some of the glaze onto our swatch card. That's pretty good. Give it a quick little tap, and we'll set that one aside. Now I will take the small piece of paper, and I'm just going to take the spillover and spread that around. All right, let's put our excess glaze right back into the jar. Okay, now it is time to emboss. And these look fantastic. So let's go ahead and add our swatch card to our Distress Glaze swatch ring. I love having the Distress swatches for the glaze because the powders don't look the same in and out of the jar. And this gives me a better idea of how they're going to look on projects, and it makes a fantastic reference. So we're adding that to our ring. Before setting that aside, let's take a look at this full set of color swatches. Such a pretty picture, and Uncharted Mariner fits into the group beautifully. Okay, now for that little piece of scrap paper that we'd set aside, I'm going to take a circle punch. This is a 1-inch circle punch, and we're going to cut one small circle. We're going to then take the circle, and using a little collage medium, I'm going to be gluing it to the top of the Distress Glaze jar. Now, at a glance, it's going to be easy for me to tell which color I'm looking for. Now for our last set of swatches. I'm going to be making a quick swatch using the Distress ink and the Distress Oxide ink pads. I've pre-cut these little swatch cards, and I'm just going to take the ink and rub that right down onto the cardstock. Just a couple of quick swipes to make sure that I've got good coverage. Then I'm going to do the same thing for the Distress Oxide ink as well. That color is just so beautiful, nice and creamy. Such a good color. Okay, now that I have my two pieces of paper inked, I'm then going to be grabbing the Distress sprayer, and we're going to gently mist the cards, and this is going to give us our swatches. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now I'm going to quickly dry these off using the Ranger heat tool. All right, here are the completed swatches. The last thing I'm going to do is add a title of Uncharted Mariner to the Distress ink. I'll come back at a later time and add a title as well to the Distress Oxide. But right now, I just want to do the Distress ink. Okay, good. So I'm going to grab my ring of Distress ink swatches, and we're going to add Uncharted Mariner to the batch. So if having a new color wasn't enough, we're also getting new stencils today to play with. These just happen to be coming in on the same order that I placed along with Uncharted Mariner. So perfect timing for this latest Funkie Junkie Stencil Mania challenge. These stencil patterns are absolutely amazing. So we have the large size, and we also have the minis in these as well. In addition, we're also getting a classic set of numbers and a distressed set of numbers as well in this stencil pack. For Stencil Mania, we're not using one stencil, not two. We are using a total of 3 stencils on our projects this week. So to start with, I'm going to be using the stencil THS 158, and this is from the new Tim Holtz stencil set by Stampers Anonymous. And to make sure that my stencil doesn't slide around, I've put down some of the gray grip mat, then some distress heavy white cardstock. Now I'm going to put the stencil down over the top. For blending, I'm going to be using the Distress Ink Mini Blender and some dome foam. And of course, for the ink, we're going to be using some Uncharted Mariner. Let's go ahead and start loading up the dome foam with some of this beautiful Uncharted Mariner ink. I'm going to be starting at the edge of the stencil and using circular motions as I gently blend the ink through the stencil onto the paper. I find that working at the edges in small circular motions gives me the smoothest coverage for when I am doing a solid background blend. Now, as you can see, the stencil doesn't cover all of the paper for my background, but not a problem. This stencil is in a repeating pattern, so after I have the first half covered in ink, I can just slide the stencil over and continue the pattern on the rest of the paper. Okay, the coverage is looking pretty good. I'm just going to touch up a couple of spots and then we're going to gently lift up the stencil and see what we have. That looks pretty good. All right, now we're going to carefully line the stencil up and we'll continue inking the rest of our background. A little bit more ink, and again, I'm going to start from the edges and blend my way inwards. That's looking pretty good. The coverage is looking fairly even. I'm just going to go over a couple more times, and then we're going to lift our stencil off. There we go. That looks great. Now, let's move on to our next technique. Since we're playing with the brand new distress ink, I wanted to pair it with an old technique. This is the crumpled tag technique that Tim has showed on many demos. So first, I'm taking some mixed media heavy stock and I'm crumpling it up using both hands. The point of crumpling is to get some different ridges and creases into the paper. The more wrinkles and creases, the better for this technique. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now we're going to gently spread out our crumpled piece of paper. Now I'm going to take the distress ink and we're going to smush it across the top of the paper. We want the ink to catch all of the raised surfaces from the crumpling. Okay, so we have our ink on the paper. We're setting the ink aside and we're going to be going in with the distress sprayer. We're going to spray the crumpled paper and this is going to create a wicking effect. While the water works its wicking magic on our crumpled piece of paper, I have off to the side an iron that is heating up to help us finish off this technique. I'm going to continue to spritz the water over the paper until it is fully covered. Since I have a few spots that did not get much water on them, I'm going to use my fingers to move the water around to continue the wicking effect. Now we're going to go in with the iron. I'm going to set this down on the paper and let it flatten out all of the crinkly bits that we have put into the paper. Now, one word of caution. You're going to want to have a dedicated craft iron because if you try to iron clothes with this later, you might get a surprise and some inky transferal. But we're going to just move this across the paper and see what happens. There we go. That is the magic of the crinkle effect. But we're not quite done. We're going to add a finishing layer of ink going over the top of this with a little bit of Distress Vintage Photo ink. I'm going to distress the corners and then we're going to lightly ink over the top of the paper. This is going to help give it a bit more of a vintagey look. And again, I'm using the mini ink blender and some dome foam. In a gentle circular motion, I'm covering the rest of the page with some of the Vintage Photo ink. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Now we're going to go back in with the Distress Mister, and I'm going to sprinkle a few water droplets over the top of the paper. Now let's start building up our card layers. Going over the base of our ink blended background, I'm going to be placing a 5" by 3 3/4 inch piece of Ideology metallic cardstock in silver. This I've cut down to size using the Tim Holtz mini guillotine cutter. And we're going to place that on our ink blended background. For this card, I'm going to have a total of 4 layers. Next, we're going to take our crinkled background and place that over the silver metallic. This I'm going to be cutting down to 4 3/4 by 3 1/4 inches. To make life easier for me, I'm going to be kind of eyeballing this and just using a pencil to mark off the points where I want to cut. I did go back and measure after the fact to get the measurements that I just gave you, but in the middle of crafting, I prefer to roughly eyeball things. For trimming, I'm using the Tim Holtz Mini Tonic Trimming Tool. I love this size. It's the perfect size to go on my desk for when I need to make some quick cuts. So we're going to line the paper up on the marks that I've made and trim down the paper. So that looks pretty good. We're going to set aside the mini trimming tool, and now we're going to take the piece of cut paper and I'm going to add a little bit more distressing around the edge of it. Since we chopped off parts that had already been distressed, I want to go back in with the mini ink blender and distress the edges of this paper again to give it a uniform look. To attach this to our card front, I'm going to be using some of the mini foam squares. These were a great find at the dollar store. Now that I have all of my edges inked, I'm going to be attaching the foam. I'm going to be using about 6 pieces, 1 on each corner, and then 2 in the middle of this background. Using the foam allows me to give this card a little bit more dimension than if I laid everything flat while building up this card front. So let's go ahead and peel the little pieces off the back of the foam and attach this to our card. So now we're going to place this onto our card front. I'm just going to carefully line that up, make sure that I've got equal space on all sides of the card, and then push it down. That's looking pretty good. So let's move on to the next step. Now we're going to be bringing in our second stencil in the Stencil Mania challenge. Here I'm going to be using stencil THMS 159. Through the mini version of this stencil, I'm going to be blending with some Distress Vintage Photo ink. I want to bring in a little stenciling on each corner of this part of the background. I am definitely liking that. The stencil with a different scale proportion definitely added just a nice little bit of extra flair to the card. Now we're going to bring in another stencil. This is THS 197. Here we're going to be doing a straight ink blend, but this time I'm going to be using Distress Oxide inks for the blending. For inks, I've decided to go with Salvaged Patina, Cracked Pistachio, and, of course, Uncharted Mariner. These are the 3 inks that I'm going to be ink blending with through this stencil. On the top, I decided to start with some of the Cracked Pistachio, and I'm going to work in a diagonal fashion. We're going to work from the top left down to the bottom right. And again, we're using some dome foam and the mini ink blender tool. Now let's go ahead and add some Salvaged Patina. This is our mid-tone, and it's going to overlap the Cracked Pistachio and the Uncharted Mariner. So I'm going in and just trying to get a smooth transition between all of the colors by doing a bit of a circular motion while blending. So far, so good. Let's go ahead and grab our final color, Uncharted Mariner. So we're going to ink up and then we're going to blend that out onto our tag. Okay, we're going to gently overlap with Salvaged Patina, and there we go. Here is our finished ink blended tag using Distress Oxides. Now I'm just going to quickly cap these up, and then we're going to be bringing in the stamping platform. For our focal point, I decided to go with a paint layered stamped image. Here I'm going to be attaching the tag with the magnets to the stamping platform. Then I'm going to be bringing in this stamp. This is from Stamp Set CMS 232 Fresh Brewed. I'm going to carefully line up the stamp as our main focal point. Then I'm going to close the stamping platform and we're going to pick up the stamp. Good firm pressure to make sure it sticks. Next, I'm going to be going in with some Distress Archival Black Soot ink. I'm taking a mini ink and I'm going to go tap, tap, tap on the stamp and make sure that we have good coverage. That's looking pretty good. Now we're going to set the mini ink pad aside and close the lid and get our stamped impression. All right, closing up the lid. Now applying good firm pressure. Okay, now let's lift up and see what we have. Not too bad. It's not perfect, but I really just need the outlines. I'm going to be taking some distress paint and we're going to be painting the image. For distress paints, I'm going to be using Uncharted Mariner, Gathered Twigs, and Hickory Smoke. To add the paint, I'm going to be pulling out the Tim Holtz Ranger Fine Detailer Water Brush, and we're going to be using that to paint our image. I'm going to place some of the distress paints off to the side, just a little dot onto the glass media mat, and we'll use that as a workable palette while I paint in the image. So, painting in the image, let's go ahead and put this on fast forward and see how it turns out. Okay, here is our finished painted image. Now let's go back and take some of the Distress Archival Black Soot and add that to our stamp. This is going to be the final inked layer over the image, and it will crisp up those lines. Okay, now we're going to put the lid down and apply good firm pressure and see how this turns out. I love the magic of this technique. As you lift up the lid, you get to see all of the detail put back onto the stamped image. This part is always cool. And here we go, our nice crisp image filled in with paint. Okay, let's go ahead and set that aside. Now we're going to trim our focal point. Again, I'm going to be pulling out the Tonic Mini Trimmer, and we're going to be using that to cut our image down to size. There we go. All right, let's attach this final part to our card. That's going to go right in the center. To put this on, I decided to use another set of foam squares. I wanted to give this card a little bit more height, and foam squares is the quickest way to do that. So let's go ahead and place our foam squares. Then we can finish assembling this card. All right, let's go ahead and center this up. Right about there. That looks good. Press it down and done. Now, the only thing left is finishing touches. Here, I'm going to be adding a Tim Holtz Ideology sticker label. I decided to go with the sentiment, make today count. And we're going to be placing the sticker. Where do I want to put it? Top, cuts off the steam. Side, no, not really a good fit. Let's put it right down near the bottom in the center. Perfect. And here is our completed card for the Funkie Junkie Stencil Mania Challenge. On this card, we have used stencils THS 157, THS 158, and stencil THMS 159. Thank you so much for joining me here today for the Funkie Junkie Challenge. I hope that you too will take part in the creative fun over at the Funkie Junkie Challenge blog, linked down in the description box. If you would like some written instructions, feel free to check out my blog. I also will leave a link for the written directions in the description box down below. So, thank you so much for joining me here at the Crafty Corner. And until next time, happy crafting.